Imagine it's 1978. You're a 26-year-old electrician named David. You live in Melbourne, Australia. You've been working full-time for 4 years. You've saved enough for a deposit. Not a fortune, just enough. You walk into a bank on a Tuesday afternoon. You sit down with a man in a gray suit. He reviews your income. He looks at your savings. He offers you a mortgage. 3 months later, you own a modest 3-bedroom home. Brick construction, small yard, 15 kilometers from the city center. The total purchase price is roughly 3 times your annual income. You don't think of yourself as lucky. You think of yourself as normal. Everyone you know is doing this. Your older brother did it. Your parents did it. Your coworkers are doing it. Buying a house is not an achievement. It's not a milestone. It's just what happens when you work full-time for a few years. Fast forward to 2024. Your granddaughter is 26. Her name is Emily. She has a university degree. She works full-time as a project coordinator. She earns more than you ever did, even adjusted for inflation. She's been working for 5 years. She has savings. She has good credit. She cannot afford to buy a home. Not a nice home, not a large home, anywhere within 1 hour of where she works. The median home in her city now costs more than 13 times the median income. The deposit alone would take her nearly a decade to save. And by the time she saves it, prices will have risen again. She is not financially irresponsible. She is not lazy. She has done everything your generation said to do. And she is locked out. This is not a Melbourne story. This is a global story. In Sydney, Auckland, Toronto, Vancouver, London, Amsterdam, Dublin, San Francisco, Stockholm, Seoul, the pattern is identical. Housing has become structurally unaffordable for a generation of workers who earn more, work more, and save more than their parents ever did. And here's what almost no one is willing to say out loud. This didn't happen by accident. Housing didn't become unaffordable because of population growth. It didn't happen because of avocado toast. It didn't happen because young people don't work hard enough. Housing became unaffordable because it was redesigned. It was converted from a consumption good into a financial asset. And once that conversion was complete, the system locked itself in place. Politically, economically, irreversibly. This is not theory. This is documented history. And once you see the mechanism, you cannot unsee it. Let's begin with what people think is happening. The common explanation goes like this. There aren't enough houses. Demand is too high. Supply is too low. Builders can't build fast enough. Zoning laws are too strict. NIMBYs block development. Immigration is increasing, therefore prices rise. This narrative is everywhere. It's in newspapers, it's in government reports, it's in speeches from housing ministers. It's technically true, and it's almost completely irrelevant. Because here's the question that narrative doesn't answer. Why is this happening everywhere at once? Housing markets are local. Zoning laws are different in Tokyo than in Toronto. Immigration rates differ between countries. Construction industries vary in efficiency. Land availability differs by geography. Regulatory frameworks differ by jurisdiction. And yet, housing has become unaffordable in nearly every developed economy on Earth, at roughly the same time, at roughly the same rate. Tokyo builds more housing per capita than almost any other major city. Prices are still out of reach for many young workers. Houston has famously loose zoning. Housing costs have still outpaced incomes. Germany had low immigration for decades. Housing costs still climbed. You cannot explain a global, synchronized phenomenon with local, idiosyncratic causes. Something else is happening, something structural, something that cuts across borders, regulatory regimes, and construction capacity. And it has nothing to do with how many houses are being built. To understand what changed, you need to understand what housing used to be. For most of the 20th century, in most developed economies, a house was a consumption good. You bought it to live in it. Its value was its utility, shelter, stability, somewhere to raise a family. Prices were loosely tied to local incomes. And this wasn't because of some benevolent policy. It was because of how housing was financed. Mortgages were tightly regulated. Interest rates were controlled or capped. Loan-to-income ratios were conservative. Credit was limited. Banks didn't want to lend you money you couldn't pay back. Governments didn't want housing to become a source of financial instability. In most countries, housing was considered part of the social contract. Affordable housing wasn't a left-wing policy. It was a bipartisan expectation. In post-war America, the GI Bill helped returning soldiers buy homes. In the United Kingdom, council housing provided millions of affordable units. In Australia, home ownership was seen as the reward for honest labor. In Germany, rent controls and tenant protections kept the cost of living stable. Housing was not where people got rich. It was where people lived. And then something changed. The turning point happened in stages, but the fundamental shift began in the 1980s. It began with deregulation. In the United States, the Depository Institutions Deregulation and Monetary Control Act of 1980 lifted interest rate caps. The Garn-St. Germain Act of 1982 deregulated savings and loan institutions. Mortgage lending became more competitive. Lending standards began to loosen. In the United Kingdom, Margaret Thatcher's right to buy policy in 1980 allowed tenants to purchase their council homes at steep discounts. Over the next 2 decades, over 2 million units were sold. Public housing stock was never replaced. The government effectively privatized its affordable housing supply and converted it into private assets. In Australia, negative gearing, a tax policy allowing property investors to deduct rental losses from their taxable income, was expanded and entrenched. Combined with a 50% capital gains tax discount introduced in 1999, the tax code began to favor property speculation over productive investment. In Canada, the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation expanded mortgage insurance, allowing buyers to purchase homes with smaller deposits. Credit became easier. Demand rose. None of these policies were sold as ways to make housing unaffordable. They were sold as ways to expand home ownership, to democratize wealth, to give ordinary people a stake in the economy. But there was a second-order effect that no one talked about publicly. When you make it easier to borrow money to buy a house, you don't make houses cheaper, you make them more expensive. Every additional dollar of credit that enters the housing market gets absorbed into prices. This is not speculation. This is how asset markets work. When demand increases but supply is constrained, prices rise. And housing supply is always constrained. Land is finite. Construction takes time. Zoning laws don't change overnight. Planning approvals take months or years. There's no factory that can double housing output on demand. So as credit expanded, prices rose. And as prices rose, people who already owned houses became wealthier. Not because they worked harder, not because they added value, simply because they were standing in the right place when the money arrived. This is where the game changed. Once housing prices started rising faster than incomes, a new logic took over. If prices are rising, buying a house is no longer just about shelter. It's about investment. It's about building wealth. It's about being on the right side of an appreciating asset. And once housing becomes an asset, everything changes. Banks want to lend more. Higher prices mean more valuable collateral. More lending means more profit. They have every incentive to keep prices rising. Governments want prices to rise. Higher home values mean higher property tax revenues. Higher home values mean wealthier voters. Wealthier voters are happier voters. And in most developed democracies, homeowners vote at higher rates than renters. Existing homeowners want prices to rise. Their net worth is tied to their property. Their retirement security is tied to their property. Their children's inheritance is tied to their property. Any policy that lowers prices threatens their wealth. Developers want prices to rise. Higher sale prices mean higher profit margins. They have no incentive to flood the market with supply. Pension funds begin buying property. Private equity funds begin buying property. Hedge funds begin buying property. Housing is no longer just for people who want to live somewhere. It's for anyone who wants exposure to a stable, appreciating asset class. And once all these actors are aligned, the system becomes self-reinforcing. Higher prices attract more capital. More capital pushes prices higher. Higher prices justify looser lending. Looser lending pushes prices higher still. This is not a market correction. This is a ratchet. It only moves in one direction. If you think this is new, it isn't. Every asset bubble in history follows the same pattern. Credit expansion, rising prices, a belief that prices can only go up, and the gradual exclusion of everyone who didn't get in early. The Dutch tulip mania of the 1630s, the South Sea bubble of 1720, the Florida land boom of the 1920s, the Japanese asset price bubble of the 1980s, the United States housing bubble of the 2000s. Each of these episodes followed the same mechanism: easy credit, rising prices, a collective delusion that this time was different. But here's what makes housing different from tulips or tech stocks. You can't live in a tulip. You can't sleep in a NASDAQ certificate. You can't raise children in a cryptocurrency wallet. Housing is not optional. Everyone needs it. And when the price of a necessity rises beyond affordability, the consequences are not abstract. They are human. Japan's asset bubble peaked in 1989. At its height, the land value of the Imperial Palace in Tokyo was said to exceed the value of all the real estate in California. Residential property in major cities reached 30 times annual income, and then it collapsed. What followed was not recovery. It was stagnation. 2 decades of falling prices. An entire generation of Japanese workers who bought at the top and spent their adult lives underwater on mortgages. Deflation, demographic decline, a permanent scar on the economy. China is facing a similar reckoning today. Evergrande, country garden, tens of millions of unfinished apartments, 60% of household wealth tied to property, a property market valued at over $60 trillion, larger than the United States, European Union, and Japanese markets combined. And now, prices are falling. The question is not whether housing asset bubbles are dangerous. History has answered that question. The question is what happens when the bubble cannot be allowed to pop. That is the trap. Here is the mechanism that no politician will explain. In most developed democracies, between 60 and 70% of households own their home. These households vote. They vote at higher rates than renters. They donate to political campaigns. They organize. They show up at local planning meetings. They have economic interests, and they defend those interests at the ballot box. Their primary asset is their home. For many of them, especially older homeowners, it is their retirement plan. It is their children's inheritance. It is their financial security. If housing prices fall by 20%, these households lose 20% of their net worth. Not theoretical wealth, actual wealth. Wealth they were planning to spend. Now ask yourself a simple question. Simple. What politician, in any democracy, will run on a platform of reducing home prices? This is not a rhetorical question. This is a structural constraint. Any policy that would meaningfully improve housing affordability, mass public housing construction, land value taxation, restrictions on investor purchases, looser zoning across the board, would, by definition, reduce the price of existing homes. And the people who own existing homes will not vote for that. They will organize against it. They will fund opposition campaigns. They will show up at city council meetings. They will write letters. They will vote out anyone who threatens their wealth. This is not corruption. This is democracy working as designed. The majority is protecting its economic interests. The problem is that the majority is already inside the castle, and they've pulled up the drawbridge. This is why housing policy in every developed country follows the same pattern. Governments announce concern about affordability. They commission reports. They hold summits. They promise action. And then they implement policies that do nothing to lower prices. First home buyer grants, shared equity schemes, tax credits for deposits, subsidized loans. None of these policies reduce prices. All of them increase demand. Some of them directly transfer taxpayer money into the pockets of existing homeowners by pushing up purchase prices. This is not incompetence. This is the system working exactly as intended. The goal is not to make housing affordable. The goal is to appear to care about affordability while protecting asset values. Think about what that means. The burden of this system falls unevenly. In 1980, the median age of a first home buyer in Australia was 25. Today it is 36. In the United Kingdom, it was 27. Today it is 34. In Canada, it was 25. Today it is 35. The delay is not because young people are less capable. It is because they need more time to save, more time to pay down debt, more time to wait for inheritances or family assistance. A 2021 study by the Reserve Bank of Australia found that over 60% of first home buyers under the age of 30 received financial assistance from their parents. This is not a housing market. This is a wealth transfer system. The ability to buy a home is increasingly determined not by your income, but by your parents' assets. And if your parents don't own property, you are locked out. Homeownership rates among young adults have collapsed across the developed world. In the United States, homeownership among adults under 35 fell from 43% in 2004 to 37% in 2016. In the United Kingdom, it fell from 59% to 34% in a single generation. These are not minor shifts. These are structural changes to the social contract. For generations, the promise was simple: work hard, save money, buy a home, build equity, retire with security. That promise has been broken. Not because young people failed, because the game changed and no one told them. The effects of this system extend beyond individual hardship. They distort the entire economy. When housing is expensive, workers cannot afford to live near jobs. Commutes lengthen. Productivity falls. Families have less time. Stress increases. Birth rates decline. When housing is an investment, capital flows into property instead of productive enterprise. Entrepreneurs cannot compete with rental yields. Startups cannot outbid buy-to-let investors. Innovation suffers. A 2019 study by economists Chong-Tai Hsieh and Enrico Moretti estimated that restrictive housing policies in high-productivity American cities had reduced national GDP by over 36%. Not a rounding error. A third of the country's potential output lost to housing dysfunction. Workers cannot move to where the jobs are. They are trapped by affordability. Cities that should grow cannot grow. Talent clusters in places with lower productivity because those places have cheaper housing. The entire geography of economic activity is distorted by the cost of shelter. And this feeds back into housing prices. High productivity cities become even more expensive. Low productivity cities stagnate. The gap widens. This is not a free market. This is a market captured by those who got in first. At this point, there are only three possible outcomes. The first is that prices continue rising indefinitely. Home ownership becomes a hereditary privilege. Society divides permanently into those who own and those who rent, a new form of feudalism, with titles written in property deeds instead of royal charters. Some countries are already on this path. In the United Kingdom, over a quarter of housing is now owned by landlords. In some American cities, institutional investors own over 30% of single-family rental stock. The trend is accelerating. The second option is a controlled deflation. Prices fall slowly, over decades, managed by policy. Existing homeowners lose wealth gradually. Young buyers gain access gradually. Pain is spread across time. This requires political courage. It requires leaders willing to tell homeowners that their asset is not going to appreciate forever. It requires accepting electoral consequences. It requires resisting the lobbying of real estate developers, banks, and property investors. There is no major developed democracy currently pursuing this option. The third option is a disorderly crash. Credit tightens, prices collapse, banks fail, negative equity traps millions, foreclosures spike, a recession follows. This happened in the United States in 2008. It happened in Japan in 1990. It happened in Ireland in 2010. It happened in Spain. It happened in Greece. The aftermath was not a reset. It was devastation. Families lost their homes. Retirements were destroyed. A generation was scarred. And here's the part that matters. None of these outcomes is painless. None of them is avoidable. The only question is who pays the cost and when. That's the trap. We are now entering a new phase. Interest rates, which fell for 40 years, have begun to rise. In 2022 and 2023, central banks in the United States, Europe, the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand raised rates at the fastest pace in a generation. For decades, falling rates masked the dysfunction of housing markets. As rates fell, borrowers could afford to pay more. Prices rose, but monthly payments stayed manageable. That mechanism is now reversing. Higher rates mean higher mortgage costs. Higher mortgage costs mean reduced affordability. Reduced affordability should, in theory, mean lower prices. But prices are not falling as fast as affordability is declining. Why? Because existing owners are holding. They are not selling. They are waiting. They are hoping rates will fall. They are refinancing where they can. They are renting out spare rooms. They are doing whatever it takes to avoid realizing a loss. And because supply is constrained, because homeowners won't sell at a loss, because developers won't build into a falling market, because zoning hasn't changed, prices stay high even as demand falters. The result is a freeze. Transactions collapse. Young buyers remain locked out. Older owners remain locked in. The market doesn't clear. This is not sustainable. Something has to give, but no one knows what, and no one knows when. The system has reached a structural limit. It cannot continue as it is, but it cannot reverse without pain. And the political system is not designed to allocate pain. It is designed to defer it. There is one more piece of the mechanism. Wealth that cannot be earned by the young will be inherited from the old. In the United Kingdom, the total value of inheritances is projected to exceed £100 billion per year by 2035. In Australia, the intergenerational wealth transfer is expected to exceed $3 trillion over the next 2 decades. This is not wealth that was created. It is wealth that was transferred by policy. It is a policy dividend paid to those who happen to own property at the right time, now being passed to their children. And if your parents weren't homeowners, you inherit nothing, your children inherit nothing, the gap widens and widens and widens. This is the logical endpoint of the asset game. Not a meritocracy, not even a market, a hereditary system. Birth determines wealth. Wealth determines housing. Housing determines security. We have names for societies that organize themselves this way. We do not usually call them democracies. Here is the question. No politician, no economist, no central banker wants to answer, what is a house for? Is it a place to live? Or is it a financial asset? Because it cannot be both. If housing is meant to be affordable, then prices must stay low relative to incomes. This means the value of your house should not grow faster than your wages. This means it should not be a wealth-building vehicle. This means retirement security cannot depend on property appreciation. If housing is meant to be an investment, then prices must keep rising. This means housing will become progressively less affordable. This means young workers will be permanently excluded. This means wealth will concentrate among those who already own. You cannot have it both ways. You cannot promise affordable housing and ever-rising house prices. The two are mathematically incompatible. Every politician who says otherwise is lying or doesn't understand arithmetic. We have chosen, as societies, to make housing an investment. We have chosen this through tax policy, through credit policy, through zoning policy, through pension policy, through electoral incentives. We did not choose it consciously. We did not vote on it explicitly, but we chose it. And now we are living with the consequences. Let me leave you with this. There is a pattern in history. When an asset becomes detached from its productive value, when its price is sustained not by utility but by the belief that someone else will pay more, when the people who profit most are those who got in early and held on, when the young are told their only path is to wait for inheritance or accept permanent tenancy, that system does not correct gently. It does not reform itself. It does not wake up and choose fairness. It continues until it cannot. And when it stops, the consequences are not evenly shared. The people who lose are not the people who profited. The people who pay are not the people who caused it. This has happened before. In Japan, in Ireland, in Spain, in the United States. It is not a question of if, it is a question of when, and what remains after. This is historical and educational analysis. It is not financial or investment advice. Nothing in this video should be taken as a recommendation to buy, sell, or hold any asset. Consult a licensed professional before making financial decisions. This channel exists to study systems before they fail. Most people don't notice the pattern until they're caught in it. If you want to see the mechanism before it plays out, then subscribe.